4:30 in here?
It's 4:15 for the discussion panel.
What is the discussion about? I'm coming for extra credit.
Yeah.
What is it about?
Russia.
The Ottoman Empire, Islamic movements, and theories of nationalism. Okay. He's recently co-authored a book on the Gulen movement titled Gulen is that movement, Circumspect Activism and Faith, based on reform. His research focuses on the development of knowledge like this in the Middle East, and some of the most research subjects are the effects of Islam and nationalism. Okay, so please stop.
What do you want me to do first? I've just got a quick overview. I kind of talked through the whole history. Take this because I can't talk too much. Here, you can get the stick and drag me off. I did put up a picture here, a map of Crimea. Some of the places here, Severa Hall is the capital. This is that is where the Persian parties are. This is Sevastopol. This is Balaclava, Yalta, Theodosia, and Kerch. This is the good. Right at the end, we just stand here and see Russia. I know. It's really great. I did want to start with a little bit about the formation of Russia and the importance that the Crimea and even Ukraine has on this development. The Russia was founded with the development of the Scandinavians coming down the Russian rivers to get to Constantinople, which is right here. And as they went down the rivers, this is during the Viking Age, they met and mixed with the Rus, or the Slavic people. I'm not quite sure, at least I have not had a decisive decision on how this term got developed. But two of the important cities were Kiev here and Novgorod. And these were the founding of the Russian state. So it was really to the west of what we think of as Russia, although Novgorod is still in Russia. The story developed in the Crimea with the city of Khersones. It was an old Greek colony that had been part of the Roman Empire and then became part of the Byzantine Empire. And as the story goes, Vladimir, the great prince of Kiev, had ambitions to be allied with the Byzantine Empire. So he captures this town and then negotiates with the Byzantine Emperor to allow him to marry the sister of the emperor. But she says, no, she will not marry him unless he converts to Christianity. And so it's all along the Russian Primary Chronicle. I know lots of good legends, but I don't have time to tell you about them. But anyway, the agreement is made, and it's here that he was baptized in Crimea, and he becomes Christian. And in those days, when he became Christian, everybody becomes Christian. So this was the foundation of the Christian empire of Russia. In the same area of Ukraine, you see some of the great leaders. Alexander Nevsky, if you know anything about Russia, Alexander Nevsky was one of the great heroes. He's the one who fought off the defeated the Swedes. He fought off the Germans in the Battle of the Ice, right? And so he's one of the great heroes, but he isn't from Moscow. He is the Grand Prince of Kiev and Novgorod in this western part. And so this is extremely important because when I talk to, I have a son who lives in Russia, and so I get kind of talk to him about what's going on and what's the attitude there about all of this. And he says that there's just too many Russians. They see this as part of Russia. not being part of Russia is just, it's like if suddenly we said, well, we'll just let Virginia and New England become separate. But how can we talk about the United States without Virginia and New England? Because that's where we found it. And it's so embedded in this idea that this is part of Russia. But this is a good, quick summary of why we're here. This is the foundation of Russia. Very quickly, the Mongols conquered this area, and the Alexandrians stepped into the tributary efforts. And they lasted until about 1441, when you see they fell apart, and the Crimean family is going to be the successor of the Golden Fort. And this is what Tamer is going to talk about a little bit. This is a little bit about the few pictures of their palace. Here's an on the horse, and it all changed with the time period of Catherine the Great, when she comes down and she conquers this area. And I just want to show you these markers here. You can see them. These were set up at every place that she stopped along her trip. And so a lot of them were destroyed, but there are a few found in there in Crimea. And this is where she takes over again and becomes part of Russia. And now it continues this power struggle. Is it part of the Slavic north, or is it part of the south? So you get a little bit of a power struggle already at the time of Catherine the Great. As time goes on, again, I'm jumping very quickly, we get to the decline of the Ottoman Empire, at which point Russia is pushing further and further downward. That makes European powers like France nervous, and we get the Crimean War. How many of you know the Crimean War, the charge of the electric aid? I've seen one person there. The Crimean War fought in Crimea, right? Britain and France joining the Ottoman Empire, fighting against Russia, right? And so again, you can see the battlefields now in the charge of the light brigade, half a league down. Let you see some of the developments. This is a very famous statue. This is where the Russians scuttled their ships to prevent the British and French from landing. And so they did that just recently, didn't they? Once again. Notice a lot of Russians. This is the old Russian, what would you call it, Florida? Everybody goes there in the summer. The summer all along the coast, you get wall tourists, and they're everywhere. So, anyway, that's what the Crimean War. Jump ahead, I'm jumping ahead again, but of course during World War I and the Russian Revolution, and if you know anything about the Russian Revolution, it broke out into the Civil War. The Reds, the communists against the white Russians, the old aristocracy, were very conservative, and again it's at Crimea that the last of the generals of the White Russian Army leaves the 1920s, and that's a picture of him. And his name is Petro Wrangel. And so again, this ties to the Crimea. World War II. How many? Okay, World War II, the Great Patriotic War. Notice whether they call it World War II, you're Western League. Great Patriotic War, you're Communist League. And you see a lot of this in Eastern Europe. It's a really tragedy. They were taken over by the communists. They were very heavy-handed in this Ukraine, coming down very hard on forcing people to, the farmers to join into these big cooperative farms. And so there was a lot of people very unhappy. So when the Germans started to rise up and started to talk about coming in and invading Ukraine, a lot of people saw them as the savior. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they were, a lot of people were very, very supportive of the Nazis until they discovered the Nazis were not very friendly either. So what you get is a great tragedy because as the Germans are pushing east and going through the Crimea. First of all, they're very harsh because they see the Ukrainians as subhuman, and they want the land and not the people, so they're very harsh in killing people. And the Soviets have the scorched earth policy because destroy everything, don't let anything get into the hands of the Germans. They get all the way to the east, and then the Soviets come back. The Germans have the scorched earth policy. So it is a long history of tragedies. And indeed, throughout the Crimea, you see these war memorials. I just have a few in here just to show you all the way to the, this is a famous one that got, is right at the end of the eastern end. This is Kerch. And in May 1944, the Germans sacked Kerch. 10,000 Soviet troops and Jews descended into, this is a site of an old mine, and they, or a stone quarry, and they descended into there and hid in there, coming out at night to attack the Germans. And they held out for 170 days before they were all killed. A lot of them shot and many of them gassed to death. So they have a lot of these memorials where they talk about the terrible death. And they also, I found this interesting talking about the Soviets. I was taken to a site with no memorial, but it was when the Soviets were being pushed back, and the general wanted to wall the mountain so that they would stop the Germans from passing through. And there was a hospital there. And he ordered them to evacuate, and there was too many people. So he blew up the mountain, and it all fell out of the hospital. And so these kind of atrocities are part of their cultural heritage that I think is extremely important to do. Again, Yalta Conference. Guess where that was? The Crimea. So again, this tie to the Crimea. This is where it was held. I just want a quick couple things here. The Russian fleet today. These were, some are 2010. You can see the Russian fleet here. This is Balakova. This town was off the map. You never saw this in the Soviet Union. This was a town that was forbidden for even a lot of Soviets. You didn't have a reason to go there. You couldn't get in. It was off the, you just couldn't go there. One of the reasons was, this is a secret nuclear sub factory. And so now you can go in, it's a tourist site, but you can go in and see the sub factory. Very dark, very heavy doors, but they found alternative uses. So there is a lot of interest in it. I found this interesting too. They also had a lot of nuclear fallout shelters. This one was repurposed. What would you do with a nuclear fallout shelter? What is it? A museum. But not a museum of nuclear war, a museum of the citizens. Go figure. This is Crimean Pakistan. Quickly, because Dr. Balci is going to talk about that. Well, just a minute about the Crimean carry-outs. This is another minority group that's keeping their head down these days. This is an interesting group. They're a Jewish group. But they believe in the Torah, no Talmud, no rabbinical issues, and support. They are very puritanical. The Crimean Karaites seem to have developed, they have a Turkish language, and so they are an interesting group that's in there. During World War II, Hitler decided they were not Jews. He was told they were Jews. So they escaped. They were undesirable, but they weren't able to exterminate. But that means when they died later, they got people very good for it because of the fact that they had survived, and they would survive because they were told they were Jews when they were Jews. But they have an interesting history, real quick here. They lived for many centuries in cave towns. Up here, you see up here, all along here, you can't see it. I'm looking coming through the phone. But here, the page cuts. They took his face, man-made and natural, and lived right above this and used these caves for storage and defense. Most of these are now abandoned, but they're very interesting, and you can see how deep the roots are in the stone and the fact that it lasts for a long time. Yes? So that is enough of me. If you have any questions, I'll go with that. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes you just exit. See the exit right there?
All right, I'm going to talk about, let me take my time so that I know how fast, how slow I need to go. Now, Crimean Tatars, today they make up around 12% of the population in Crimea. But once they used to dominate the region, they were the majority population. So I don't have as much visual as Dr. Adair presented. So now they were practically remnants of Mongols. Their founder, Melek Hajigiray, later on they call him Melek, which means angel. So it was better rate for a politician to get that title. So, or sometimes they call him Hacı Devlet Giray. Devlet means state because he was the founder. And his ancestors intermarried with the Genghis Khan's family. They are regarded as a Turco-Mongolian dynasty. So now Genghis Khan has a negative connotation in the West, but it is still a name people give it to their children in Turkey. Because you may sometimes encounter these people with the name Genghis or Genghis Khan. They would probably give that name to their children. And now, who were the Crimean Khans? Now, Hajigiray actually had to fight against the Golden Horse, the Mongolian state, to get his independence. Now, generally, as a sign of independence, it was considered that he minted his first coin in 1441. And now this was their flag. The Crimean Tatars still use this flag. It's a symbol of scale, now symbolizing justice. You will see that in many different areas assembled. So he sent his capital near a village in Bahçesaray. Bahçesaray practically means the garden palace, or palace garden, might be translation. So he sent his rule. Now when we look at the earlier period of the region, so the Kıpçak Khanate was dominating that area. Now here these borders are pretty much roughly estimates. This story is made later on. We never have accurate borders. But you see where the Crimea is in the southern part, where Kaffa is with yellow color. That area was actually ruled by Genuines. There was a genuine colony in Kaffa, and they controlled it up until 1475. We will get to them again. Now here, this is when Crimea was founded, the area they control, Crimean Khanate, and their neighbors. You see the Moscow is up north. Now once we look at the foundation of Russia, reaching back to 1480s, now Prince of Moscow, they used to be tax collectors for Mongols. They were practically tributary states to Mongols, and they learned how to rule Mongol style. We see that in practice very much today. And so here, from the beginning, long-term Russian goal was to reach the warm seas. Because initially their first access was to northern sea. It was frozen half of the year. Even Baltic Sea was considered as a warm sea. And later on, Black Sea. Now compared to the people here, we go to the island. Black Sea is pretty cold. But for Russians, it was a warm sea.
All those tourists.
Yes, it's
Summer vacation.
Our summer houses are located in generally the southern part of Russia. So who are the Crimean Tatars? There are practically three different mixture of groups. The Tats, they live in the mountainous regions of Crimea before they were exiled in 1944. Or Yaliboyu lived in the southern coast of Peninsula. And the Nogais were from the Crimean steppes. And the first two groups, Tats and Yaliboy, were a mixture of different Turkish tribes, Kipchak or Kuman Turkic tribes. Now, Kuman language has become the common language of the Crimeans later on, or Crimean Tatars. So, up until the 16th century, they used it, but later on they mixed up with other groups, like Khazars, Pecheneks, and in the region, because of the trade, we will talk about what kind of trade. Because of the trade in the region, there were significant population of Armenians, Greeks, the Ostrogoths, and Genuans later on. This population mixed up. The Kuman language will become the common language of the people, pretty much bringing a partial cultural unity. And Crimean Tatars become Muslims in the early 14th century, and they will establish religious ties, but they will also still carry some features from shamanism or Göktanrı belief of the pre-Islamic Turks. For example, you saw in their flag the blue color. The blue color refers to sky. This ancient Turkish belief, they believe in there is one God in the sky. So that's why blue color has been used. You may know the blue color, sometimes they call turquoise in the West. So that blue is actually coming from pre-Islamic beliefs. So they started building mosques by the time Russians controlled the region. There were almost 1600 Islamic centers, mosques or madrasas in Crimea. Now, how did they get along? How did they survive? They were mainly getting revenues from the slave trade. Yes, that was a legitimate trade in the medieval times, all over the world. And they were doing raids to Ukraine and Russia, and also to Circassia. Now here, I mentioned about the Mamluk Empire. Mamluk Empire was in Egypt. The term Mamluk means slave. That was a slave empire. So in this empire, the rulers come from the slave background. Every year, Mamluk rulers would travel from Egypt to Crimea, and they would buy Circassian boys from the slave markets, and these boys would be brought and provided military and whatever best education as possible, and they would become the future rulers of the Mamluk Sultans, Mamluk Sultanate. So, if you were coming from slave background, you were eligible to become sultan. If you were a freeborn person, you were ineligible. So coming from slave background was a privilege in this Mamluk Empire. So that's why the approach to slavery was different. So here, Genoa had a colony. Genoans were interested in slave trade as well. Actually, they were delivering the slaves, sometimes from Black Sea coast to Mamluks as well. And their existence goes as early as the 14th century. Beginning of 14th century, actually, they captured some regions from the Venetians. Now, the slave trade, Kaffa, had one of the biggest slave markets in the medieval times. Estimated numbers within 300 years, 15th century, 18th century, around 2 million slaves were taken from this region, from Ukraine, Russia, Circassia, Belarus, and Poland, and through the raids. And as we mentioned, in the Mamluk Empire, they were relying on the soldiers and the recruitments from that region. So actually this slave culture, the slave ruler culture, Mamluks were the elite group in Egypt. They were pretty much in power until the 19th century, even after Ottomans took over. Now here, Crimea, as the protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. Now you see Crimea, Ottoman Empire took the Genoan colony of Kaffa in 1471, and they become close allies with the Crimean Khanate. Although they were protectorate, they had special status. Coming from the Turkic background, coming from Muslim background, because of its strategical location, Crimean Tatars could provide soldiers for Ottoman Empire. When Ottoman Empire had a campaign in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, Crimean Tatars would send them help. And again, when Ottoman Empire had wars against Iran in the east, they would request Crimean Tatars to move east direction. So, with the strategical location, their alliance was doing well at the beginning. So, starting from the period of Suleiman the Magnificent from 1520s, the Crimean Khanate was given the authority to collect tax from Moldavia and Poland. So, here, they even actually, Crimean Tatars were in great position actually. They defeated Russian armies several times in the 17th century. But the tide is changing after the 17th century. Russia is gaining more ground and Russia is getting stronger, and Crimean Tatars are no longer match for them. But at the same time, there are raids coming from the Zaporozh Cossacks. They are practically ancestors of today's Ukraine. And they could actually, their raids were a lot more successful because they were using fire weapons. And they did raids as far as to Bosporus, almost to the Ottoman capital, to the Black Sea coast of the Ottoman Empire. They had, in the early 1600s, they had many raids, and Ottomans could not do anything against them. Actually, what happened is, in order to stop their raids, Ottoman Empire threatened Russia that if you don't stop them, we will declare war on Russia. Now here, these Cossacks played very good among great powers. Ottoman Empire, Poland and Russia, they all wanted to control this warrior group. And this warrior group was aware of it, and they used it. For example, in 1672, Ottomans came to their help because Poland reached to their area. Poland invaded them. So Ottomans come and help them put Hetman Zoroastrian in charge after defeating Polish troops. And in less than 10 years, he joins Russia. So we will see that they will be switching sides. They were very opportunistic. Now here, another significance of it in the Ottoman Empire. Now the Ottoman sultans engaged in polygamy. They had so many offsprings, but the problem was whenever a sultan came to power, they pretty much killed their brothers to eliminate any alternative or rivalry. So at some point it came to a point that a sultan had only one brother. And they panicked, what are we going to do if the Ottoman dynasty run out of male offspring? And they said, okay, in case it happens, the Crimean Khanate ruler is going to be the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. So that signifies their importance. And here, Ottoman failure in with the siege of Vienna in 1683. So the Grand Vizier was relying on Crimean Khanate to hold on to the bridges of Danube so that they would stop the Polish troops coming from north to help Austria. But Grand Vizier didn't provide him with enough weapons or cannons, so they were not able to hold it. That will pretty much bring their end together. So an important point in the Crimean history, Ottomans lost Crimea. Practically, Crimea became independent after the Ottoman-Russian War. So independence lasted very short. In 9 years, Russia will annex Crimea and Ottoman Empire will not be able to do anything about it. Now this is important because for the first time, Ottoman Empire lost a land with a majority Muslim population. And from now on, we will see that Ottoman sultans are using the title of Caliph more often, emphasizing that they are protectorate of the Muslim population, even though they are not politically ruling that. Now here, after this period, we will be seeing that approximately 2/3 of Tatar population is perished or leaving this area, Russification. Now Russia had a long-term goal of to reach the long seas, and they declared that Moscow is the third Rome. Russian Orthodox claim that original Rome is controlled by Catholics, the second Rome, Constantinople, is ruled by Muslims, and the Moscow is going to be the third Rome and new center of Christianity. So their goal was to control all Orthodox Christians. That would actually help them to reach to the War Seas. It's kind of ironic, the third Rome ended up becoming center of communism eventually. Now here, in the Soviet Union, starvation of the civil war, established collectivization policies and fall of famine, and at the beginning of the Soviet Union, half of the Crimean Tatars were either killed or exiled. So their numbers changed very quickly. And in World War II, now in World War II, even though significant number of Tatars joined the Red Army, they were fighting against Germans. Some portions joined the Nazis to support the Nazis, but Russia blamed them all and started the whole population exile. People were given 30 minutes notice to pack up their belongings and leave. And now this exile was practiced not only for the Crimean Tatars, also people in the strategic border regions. For example, Turkey's border with Georgia. People in that region, Germans didn't even reach to that area. People from that region, they were exiled to Central Asia as well. So now, almost half of this population died, either during the exile or later. And they were allowed after the Soviet Union collapse, they were allowed to come back, return, but since then, around 250,000 of them returned. Now that, in today's numbers, they constitute around 12% of the population. And lately they didn't participate in this referendum, they boycotted it. Because they said it's just a fake referendum to take Russian control. And they are very seriously scared of Russian control in Crimea because of their past 200 years of history has never been positive for them. And they would prefer to remain under Ukrainian rule. But we will see how the politics and they will not have a shot on this great politics, unfortunately, as a minor forward. But now, actually worldwide, there are more Crimean Tatars are living outside Crimea than in Crimea. There are around 1.5 million to 3 million migrants and their generations living in Turkey. There's a large population living in that area. They are trying to effect the political decision-making process, but so far that hasn't been successful. All right, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
As Dr. Wirts pointed out when she was introducing you, I was called in 2007 to serve as a professor of American Studies at Moscow State University. And in the process of preparing for that, as a U.S. historian and someone who specializes in American Indians, I was rather disturbed about what I was going to do in Moscow. And so the more I read about it in preparing to go, the more interested I became in, first off, the ways in which, as Dr. Balci has pointed out, the ways in which non-Russian people have been dealt with in the development of the Russian Empire, and how that compared with the way that in the Americas we dealt with our own non-majority populations. And I especially began to realize that there was a significant similarity in the fictions that Americans tell themselves about our expansion and our creation of a continental empire, and the fictions that Russians tell themselves about their establishment of a continental empire. And so what I lectured on when I was in Moscow was on comparing the American views of their frontier and the Russian views of their frontier, and how our frontier experiences have sort of shaped our view of the world, and to a very large extent, our view of each other. That essentially Americans and Russians are two two expansive, aggressive frontier societies looking at each other. And that creates a very interesting situation for us and for the world. So by way of shameless self-promotion, I just wanted to point out that the net result of this work that I did in Russia ended up as a chapter in this book called Prelude to Rivalry, the Frontier Foundations of Two Global Empires. And in this article, I go into quite a lot of depth about how these frontier ideologies and frontier identities were crafted over the course of time, and how the American overland empire and the Russian overland empire can in fact be compared historically. The reason I blew up the opening footnote was just to make the point that the people on this panel were great contributors to this work, and I wanted to make the point that this is something we've been talking about among ourselves for quite a while. That this is something that has been growing over time. To kind of jump in, and I put a bunch of quotations here and citations, which really are there for you. I'm not going to read all of these quotations, but I wanted to illustrate that what I'm drawing on here is a broad range of historical writing that sort of focuses on the understanding of Russia as a frontier society. Those of us who grew up in the West, and especially, I guess, those of my age who grew up in the Cold War, we think of Russia as something entirely foreign and something entirely strange, whose experience is entirely outside of anything Americans have ever gone through. And what I discovered in looking at the sort of history of Russia is that it was very much a frontier society. Dr. Adair, for example, talked about the history of the Kievan state and the creation of the empire of the early Russians, which was, according to historian James Forsyth, he points out that essentially the Russian Empire was, from the very beginning, a frontier phenomenon, and that it experienced the creation of empire in much the same way as European imperial powers, except that their empire focused on overland rather than overseas expansion. Then to go into talking about Novgorod and Kiev, between the years about 900 and 1240, there was an expansion of this Russian state, which had its origins actually in Ukraine, which expanded all the way from the area that we saw on the map earlier in Ukraine all the way to the Ural Mountains. So it controlled all of what we think of as the European part of Russia. And as historian Joseph Wojcinski pointed out in what's one of the most eye-opening articles on Russian expansion, that this was, in effect, a frontier society in exactly the same way as the American frontier society, in terms of the strategies that it used, in terms of the impact that it had on the people who lived within it. And also, as I came to realize and what focused my attention, in terms of their own mythology about themselves, and what that what that frontier experience meant for them as a people. And then moving on after the fall of that empire with the Mongols and the Tatars coming in, that empire was destroyed and was then brought back into existence in the 15th century, where there was a renewal of this imperial mentality, initially under Ivan III and Ivan IV, and the whole mentality, and again, Wojcinski talks about this in interesting detail. The whole idea of the recovery of empires being like the recovery of a lost frontier. So rather like the discussions that took place in America about territories that were, for example, became French territory, Americans saw that as territory lost to them, territory that rightfully belonged to them, which they were then entitled to go and take back. And that during this period of recovery from the Mongol invasions, Russians became extraordinarily aggressive in trying to reestablish the boundaries that had been under existence in the earlier stages of the Russian Empire. And finally, in the 17th and into the 18th century, we then see the establishment of a mature Russian Empire, which had, by the late part of that period, acquired the Crimea and boundaries with Turkey and expanded boundaries into Asia, which then established what we now, or what at least the Russian people now think of as the legitimate territory of Russia, which in international terms is highly disputable, because that territory which they think of as being their natural boundaries include territories that after the collapse of the Soviet Union no longer were under the control of the Russian nation. And so the Crimea is one of those highly significant symbolic territories that were part of this area that was considered necessary as a natural part of the Russian frontier, but also a natural defense against the traditional enemies that had always been on the boundary, that had always been on the frontier. And so what we see happening in the idea of defensiveness was that the Russians created an entire strategic mentality that was based on what diplomatic historians call defensive realism. The idea that we have to have aggressive and well-defended borders in order to maintain what is rightfully ours. And we in the West have tended to sort of ignore that and tend to discount it. So for example, when we look at the threat from Asia, there was, and we've seen in the previous talks, significant danger to the Russian people from Asia. So when we look at the Mongol heritage, the Tatar frontier, the threats from China, the threats from Persia and from the Ottoman Empire, those were things that the Russian people historically took very seriously. In the West, however, we've tended to say, oh, well, those weren't real threats because, oh, those were just Asians. Those are just Orientals. They're not really dangerous to anybody. And so we've tended to mythologize Russian history in a way totally opposite of the way Russians have mythologized their history. And then when we look at the historic threat from the north, my gosh, one of the maps that we just saw that showed what Lithuania looked like at one time. We think of, well, Lithuania, well, how could they be a threat to Russia? But there was a time when Lithuania was not a tiny little Baltic country. And so when we look at the threat from the north, there were major wars with Poland and Lithuania. There was significant warfare between Russia and Sweden. And so the Russians have always taken the north as being a significant threat and a frontier that they needed to concentrate on. And then the historic threat from the west. And of course, again, we in the West don't think of ourselves as threatening. We just want them to live decent lives. But from the Russian point of view, when we think of, again, the Polish threat, Poland was at one time an extraordinarily powerful society. And then we think about, I mean, we talked about the horrors of the Second World War. In Russia, there are two great horrific periods that are historically celebrated. We call horror something to celebrate, but one of them is the Patriotic War, World War II. The other is the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's army devastated large parts of Russia, and so from the Russian point of view, the West is not something to be written off lightly. And then when we think of the presence of Prussia, and then finally again with the Great Patriotic War, the German invasions in the 20th century, the West has always been on the Russians' minds. And the idea of protecting that frontier has always, from their point of view, been seen as realistic. That this was a defense that had to be made. And then finally, the historic threat from within. And again, talking about the Tatar population, talking about different Islamic populations, we talked a little bit about the differences. These were populations that were an ever-present issue in the conduct of the Russian state and had to be dealt with. And again, in the West, we've tended to write this off as an unrealistic concern, that this was simply the specter of the autocratic state and the communist putting down an iron heel on these poor people. And yet, from the long-term historical perspective, these populations have always been a threat to the basic social and political order. And so this internal threat has always been as much a part of the Russian frontier mentality as the threat of one-time conquered minorities have been in the history of the American West, of the American frontier. And often these populations were not treated a whole lot better than minority populations were treated on the American frontier. And so when we look at it this way, we can better understand how the Russians thought of themselves as a frontier society dealing with foreign powers, dealing with a raw frontier. And we can find this one of the funnest, let's say, illustrations of this Russian frontier cowboy mentality. It comes in a genre of Russian films called Easterns. And here, this is a marvelous illustration of that, The White Son of the Desert, which is this great Russian cowboy movie. And it's about Russian troops actually in Central Asia settling the frontier and defending the frontier from the barbarous hordes who are out there on the frontier. This is a particularly interesting film because this one was so much a part of the Russian self-identity that the Russian cosmonauts used to watch this film on nights before their launching, before they would go off into space. This was a film that they would watch to celebrate their Russianness. And again, when we think of the frontier, where space is just an extension of this whole frontier mentality. And so we have this cowboy mentality that then we now see reactivated. And when we look at the threats that I've just talked about, and then we go through what's going on in the contemporary world, we find exactly the same touch points are again coming to the fore. Whether we're looking at the Caucasian region, whether we're looking at Central Asia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, what we're looking at is pressure from the European Union, from NATO, from pressure points that trigger a reasonable response. Not to say that the way of dealing with it has been reasonable, but the fear is, and it falls into a historic set of self-identities that are fundamental to the way Russians view themselves. And so I think we need to not excuse Russian behavior with respect to the Crimea and with respect to the Ukraine in general, but I think we can better understand it if we realize its historic foundations. the fact that Mr. Putin has incredible popular support right now is not an index of the craziness of the Russian people. It's an index of how deeply this culture is part of Russian self-identity.
I don't have a slideshow, but I thought maybe I could find a groovy to show you. We don't have computers over at UTP, so just give me a second. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to the next one. Well, okay, I'll be mindful of leaving us some time to be able to chat. And when I was watching the events in Ukraine, I was trying to figure out, as I have been for years, what makes the Russians tick, what makes Russian society work. And actually, we just heard one of the good ideas, this frontier notion. And so I've got another thing that I would add to the pile. When I was watching the news, I wasn't too interested in the lost plane. I figured that's a tragedy, and I've been following the news from Ukraine for the past couple of months. And have y'all been following the news from Ukraine? A little bit? Okay, well, in a nutshell, there's been two crises. One crisis was the one with people on the streets facing down the police, throwing Molotov cocktails, camped out on the square, and they call that square Maidan. Maidan is just the word the Ukrainians use for square, which I think they borrowed from the Turks or the Arabs. But it's taken on a symbolic meaning as the place where you have political demonstration. So Maidan is one of the crises, and that crisis was about protesting against government corruption and the use of police violence against people, right? There was another crisis. This is the way the Russians responded to the first crisis. The Russians invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, and that's a second crisis. Now the first one, the one on Maidan, I think for us in the West is kind of an easy one to understand because it speaks to things that we understand. The news was full of all kinds of, that's perfect, that's great. The news was full of all kinds of interpretations about what happened there, but I'll tell you what I think was going on. What united these people that you see on the square was they want to live, as maybe they would say, they want to live normal lives in a normal country. And what they meant was a place where there's transparency in government and economics and not political corruption and cronyism to the scale that they had. So the people on Maidan, we can kind of understand them from things that we understand. Ideas like popular sovereignty, like the government works for the people, not the other way around. Democracy, the vote counts. Rule of law, there's some equality for everybody before the law. Civil society, which means people can have volunteer groups, people can create their own political party, and so on, things like that. I think we can understand it. That's what those people were out there doing. I think if we tried to find the most common reason why people were out there, that's it. Now, the Russian invasion of Crimea and the way they talked about it, I think is harder to understand because there's all kinds of confusing things. Russian troops show up in Russian trucks with Russian guns and Russian uniforms without Russian insignia, and people said, oh, these are spontaneous defense, self-defense forces. Best armed self-defense forces I've ever seen. The people on the Maidan had baseball bats, and some of them brought guns. You know, there was a diversity there. What else was strange? A peripheral politician was elected as the prime minister of Crimea in an election where not all the people of the local legislature were there, and there were masked gunmen in the room. And this guy was in the mob in the 90s. They called him the Goblin. And suddenly he's become the preeminent politician in Crimea. Now that's weird. Why does that happen? That's strange. You know, what makes all this work? Now, there are Russians, ethnic Russians who live in Crimea, and they genuinely do feel that their hearts and souls are in Russia, and they would love to be a part of it. So I'm not denying that there's an actual sentiment among the population that wants to be part of Russia. But to my mind, the stuff that Putin said was the craziest of all. I mean, he said Ukraine has descended into chaos. My wife was in Ukraine. She was in Kiev. We didn't do it on purpose. It just happened. She happened to take a business trip, and the next day, there's, Molotov cocktails, gunshots, and an invasion. She doesn't work for the CIA, but that happened. But that was 2 blocks from her apartment. From her apartment, she could walk the other way, go to work, go shopping, get a rubber. Putin said the new government's run by fascists, and I thought, I wish he'd come take my world history class where we do the chapter on fascism, because I don't see any of the defining characteristics of fascism. I mean, were there some fascists running around? Yes, there were, because it was a democratically plural, society. You've always got people on the far right, and you've got some on the far left. But most of the people were in the middle on Maidan, I would say. And it was interesting that Putin completely rejected out of hand any international protocols for mediation or sorting out a problem, So I think what was going on at Maidan, we can kind of understand maybe from a Western set of political values. It kind of made sense to us. These were people out protesting a government that they thought was corrupt. And if you didn't follow all the news about it, basically what happened was the president of Ukraine, he was elected in what was considered to be a basically free and fair election. There was a parliament that also seemed to have been elected in a free and fair election, not too much shenanigans going on there. But he was working on a trade agreement with the European Union. As you've seen, Ukraine is right between European Union and Russia. It's a transitional place. It's right in the middle. And at the last minute, just before they were going to sign the agreement, he backed out. And there were a lot of people in Ukraine that were looking forward to having closer ties to Europe. Not all of them, but some of them. And when he backed out of it, it sort of dashed their aspirations to become a part of Europe. But what was more important, I think, is people weren't necessarily as interested in unification with Europe as they were with the idea that if you're going to have a trade agreement with Europe, there are rules you have to play by. There has to be certain kind of transparency in how your political system works and in how your economic system works. Businessmen don't screw around. There's contracts. I pay you, I get stuff. You pay me, I give you stuff. It's got to be fair, or business doesn't work. And that's what people wanted. They wanted to have transparency in economic dealings, and they thought, if we have this deal with the IU, our politicians will have to behave better, and our businessmen too. And so they were upset about that. But the people who went out to demonstrate at first were students, right? Student demonstrators. They went out, and people thought, okay, well, that's nice, great, student demonstrators. But then the government broke up the demonstration by setting the riot police on them and beating them with sticks. And when people saw their kids getting beaten, it brought out a lot of feelings in them that this government is totally corrupt. I don't care if we go to Europe or not, but this government has got to go. In fact, I think one of the most telling details was, how in Europe they have these soccer clubs that are kind of known to be violent boozers? They get drunk and they go, they yell, and they get into their team. Those guys eventually came out onto the street, and guess whose side they were on? They were on the Maidan side, and they said, I don't care about Europe. I don't want to go to Europe, but I'll be damned if the police are going to come out and beat us. We're not going to have that kind of government in this country. It's dishonorable. It embarrasses us. So I see what happened on Maidan as this tug of war between demonstrators and opposition politicians, president on the other side, his political party, the state police, and it was a protest against corruption, cronyism, state violence made it worse, and it ended up with the president abdicating his duties. He just got up and left. He disappeared and he showed up in Russia a few days later, and while he was gone, the parliament continued to function. They got together and said, the president's gone, let's impeach him, and we'll create an interim government, we'll call new elections. So again, like from our point of view, that just kind of looks like a really messy but sort of democratic situation playing itself out. All right, so that makes sense to us, but why does the Russian part not make so much sense? Let me get straight to the what's making the Russians tick. All right, so I dug back into some things I've been thinking about and reading about what makes what makes Russia tick from a cultural point of view. And one of the things that's always stayed with me was this argument made by a scholar of literature and cultural history from Russia. He lived during the Soviet period, but really influential guy named Yuri Lotlin. And he said what makes Russia tick is they think of everything in a binary way, right? It's on or off, up or down, hot or cold, right or wrong, good or bad, winner or loser. No middle ground. No room for neutrality, no neutral zone, no room for negotiation. And his argument was that that mentality can be traced back to the sort of idiosyncrasies of Russian Orthodox Christian belief and the way it's different from Western Catholicism, right? Western Catholicism has or had three areas, right? You can go to heaven, you can go to hell, or you can hang out in purgatory for a while and sort things out, right? In Russian Orthodoxy, there's no purgatory, right? If you can go to purgatory and sort things out, it makes heaven and hell a little bit, maybe a little bit less real, or they're not the main pole between which you jump back and forth. But Lotman's argument was that because of the Russian Orthodox way of thinking of just two things, it's either heaven or hell. In Russian culture, you're always going between two opposite poles, up, down, black, white, north, south, winner, loser. And I think this is what helps us understand Putin, the way Putin thinks and the way Russians respond to him. So Putin has always, in these past few days, he's always been talking about order versus chaos, Russia versus the U.S., ethnic Russians versus Ukrainian nationalists, or some kind of benevolent government. I'm not quite sure what it is. I guess Putin thinks it's him. Nice horse. Versus what? Versus fascism. Truth versus lies. Or in some, like right versus wrong, good versus evil, injustice versus injustice. Now, the Americans aren't totally dumb. In fact, there's a smart American, I couldn't believe she was saying this kind of thing. Her name's Samantha Power. She's the representative to the UN. And she said, I think this is almost an exact quote, but I might have a word or two wrong. In any case, I'll give you the quote in a second, but she said, this is kind of like Alice in Wonderland, like through the looking glass, crazy stuff. And she said, Russian authorities have every right to be upset about the way things turned out in Ukraine. But they don't have the right to try to convince the rest of the world community that up is down and black is white. She got it, and I don't think she ever read this guy I'm talking about, who almost nobody's read, Yuri Lotlin, but she got it exactly, the binary stuff. So that binary worldview, I think, tells us a lot about the Russian mentality. We could tie it to Professor Miller's comments about the frontier. The frontier is either ours or it's yours, right? We either have it or you have it. Either we have it and we're safe, or you have it and you're a threat. It's either or. There's no middle ground. And all his statements about Ukraine were done in this way. I think it's very impossible. Again, there's other reasons for this. I'm just putting another one out on the table. Independent, democratic, kind of free market, pluralistic Ukraine is sort of inconceivable to the Russian mind. It's inconceivable the same way you could like Petersburg and Moscow. If you go to Russia, people will say, which one do you like? And if you say, I like them both, they'll say, it can't be! You must like one. You go to the museum and they say, what do you like? Do you like Russian avant-garde art? Or do you like socialist realism? You say, well, I kind of like them both. Like, yeah! You can't do it that way. It's got to be one, or it's got to be the other. So, That's a little dramatic, you know, but don't ignore your brain. You've been sitting for a while. So, from the Russian point of view, from the Putin point of view, there's not, Ukraine is either part of Greater Russia or the West has taken it over. Ukraine used to be a fraternal little brother country to Russia, but now the EU and US are scheming to get it away. There's no concept that what could actually exist is some kind of popular democracy in Ukraine, popular sovereignty in Ukraine. There's no middle ground. And so that's a great cost. It's a great cost potentially to the Ukrainians, and it's a great cost to the Russians. I think one of the, we can talk about this later if you want, but I think one of the big costs within Russia itself, despite the fact that Putin's delivered political stability, he's delivered some economic prosperity, he's delivering more global influence, it comes at a very high cost of not allowing any middle ground in Russian culture. No really free and independent political parties, no real free independent press, no real civil society where people can get together and hammer out the messy stuff that makes people creative. Makes them creative in business, makes them creative in social organizations, makes them creative in culture. Do y'all know, can you name any recent Russian cultural manifestation on the world stage? Pussy Riot. What is Pussy Riot? Pussy Riot is a political agitation group. That's what they are. They're political agitators. So the only creative element is political dissent, rather than interesting political parties, civic organizations, businessmen. That stuff is not developing. And I think what Maidan shows is that it is possible in Ukraine. That the way it's possible in Ukraine is that the Ukrainians too, like the Russians, want political stability and economic prosperity, but they see it unfolding in these neutral spaces that don't exist in the Russian cultural concept. The idea of public sphere and civil society. Ukraine, that's what Maidan is. And Ukraine itself, which literally means on the border, that's what the word Ukraine means. It means on the border. I think they see that Ukraine could be a sovereign state, neither European nor Russian, but in that neutral transitional zone between the two, but a neutral zone that within Russian culture doesn't exist. And that's why the Russians are in Crimea, and that's why they're threatening the eastern Ukraine. Sorry.
Might have time for one question. Go for it. Okay. I wanted you to room for longer. There was another group that had left the room at 5:30. So, does anybody have a quick question for any one of the panelists?
DLC US boots on the ground anytime soon or with that?
No, I don't think the Americans can afford it. And we don't care. No more than the terrorists.
Year east of it. The American is year east. How did the Americans care?
Well, I mean, sometimes I feel like a Marxist and sometimes I feel like a capitalist, but I think, the Europeans care about economics. They get so much of their oil and gas from Russia, they can't afford it. Sanctions that are too serious. At the same time, they think that, democratic forms of government, civil society lead to political stability, and you don't want an unstable border with refugees coming in. So I don't know. Any political scientists here who will predict the future?
Well, I think there will, I think Russia will play, at least what I've heard, that Russia real size free markets. And if they have too, and paradise is too much, then you have to just switch and you.
Well,
That's their only income.
One of the things I thought about when I was thinking about how the Americans have dealt with Russians in the past was during the Cold War. And George Kennan, wrote the famous long telegram in 1946. State Department said, "You've been in Moscow for a while. What should we expect from the Soviet Union?" And he gave them a lot of good advice, but one of them is they don't negotiate. They do understand the logic of force. So stand up to them where they try to expand their influence, and they will back down. And it worked many times. It worked in Berlin, it worked with the Marshall Plan, it worked in Korea in an odd way, and it didn't work in some other places. Today, I think the way you stand up to force in a global economy is you start moving the money around and creating sanctions, and that's what's happening. I've read some things that show that even without any kind of sanctions, the Russians are paying a huge financial cost. The stock market went down. Trade is going to drop off with Europe. The oligarchs' money is going to be those yachts you saw parked in the Old Harbor. Okay, those aren't going to be going anywhere. And Crimea is super expensive. It's a non-revenue producing section. I mean, they're not going to have tourism for a while.
Well, the Russians will come.
What's that?
The Russians.
They probably will, but they just dropped $50 billion on Sochi. They want that to be the Black Sea tourist site.
I just read before I came here, this is famous thing that the ATMs in Crimea out of money.
Oh, that's right. Visa and MasterCard stopped serving certain Russian banks. And so all throughout the major cities where people are using credit cards from Russian banks, they're just going to buy groceries or underwear or something. And they're saying, "I'm sorry, your card's rejected." Like, "What's going on? You're in Crimea." So it's going to cost a lot of money for the Russians to support the Crimean population and the infrastructure there.
I have a question. Where does the frontier end? Or is it like, do we see certain redefining the redefining the Russian boundary? Re-establishing new boundaries?
I don't think he has so far. And if you read the literature about Russian defensive realism, essentially the boundary, well, the boundaries of the old Soviet Union were pretty much, I think, as much as they could have wanted to control directly. What they controlled indirectly is another thing. But that did accommodate, and goes all the way back to the capital trade, that did accommodate all of that territory that was considered necessary for frontier security. In much the same way that really the Continental 48 constitutes the limits of frontier stability for the United States. And so I don't see, even in its wildest megalomaniacal dreams, couldn't imagine taking over China, for example. Well, Poland's another yeah, if you take the long view. I guess part of it comes down to the question of the extent to which Russia still sees itself as not just the protector of the Russian people, but the protector of the Slavic people. And I think there is some of that still alive. Although Poland's always been iffy because they're Catholic, which makes them suspect.
There is one model that I think is really pretty smart and it's kind of model in South Africa. That's been survived for what? All the last couple hundred years next to Russia, and at least since the 20th century, it will survive as a democracy and not be a threat to Russia when Russia doesn't threaten us too much.
I mean, the difference is that Finland, to the extent that Finland had relations with Russia, they were invasive rather than possessive. Whereas Poland is another.
Yeah.
uh,
But they have this example of living next to Russia and not being thought of as a